Welcome to ChalkTalks, recorded live at the NZME iHeart Lounge in Wellington. Stay listening to hear our expert panel discussing the future of healthcare in New Zealand. How can we achieve a more productive, sustainable and equitable healthcare system? ChalkTalks, brought to you by Secure. Reduce your hospital's waiting lists with experienced specialists and teams after hours. More cost-effective than outsourcing, Secure's insourcing service treats patients faster and closer to home.
We are here, of course, for a Health Central Chalk Talk on the future of New Zealand's healthcare, how we achieve a more productive, sustainable and equitable healthcare system. I'm Hamish Rutherford from NZME and I'm the facilitator. Hopefully I won't be doing too much of the talking after I introduce people, and there will be time at the end for questions from the floor if you could wait until we get through most of the panel discussion. We have a very high power panel here today. First is Sarah Fitt, the Chief Executive of drug buying agency Pharmac. This is a role she's had since January 2018, having previously been Pharmac's Director of Operations. And before joining Pharmac, Sarah spent 12 years as Chief Pharmacist at Auckland DHB. Next is Dr. Janice Wilson, Chief Executive of Health Quality and Safety, the Health Quality and Safety Commission, a position she has held since 2011. Janice was a psychiatrist by training. She was previously Director of Mental Health at the Ministry of Health, and she also held the role of Deputy Director at the Ministry. Next is Professor Gregor Costa, the Dean of the Faculty of Health at Victoria University of Wellington. He was previously the Chair of Counties Manukau DHB. He's been a Deputy Chair of Pharmac and been on the board of ACC, and he was until recently the Chair of WorkSafe New Zealand. Ian Powell is the Executive Director of the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, an organisation which represents around 90% of the senior doctors and dentists working in New Zealand public hospitals. Mr. Powell has held this position since 1989, during which time he has negotiated more than 100 collective agreements for the organisation's members. Next is Gary Heath, from the Business Development Executive from Secure, our sponsors tonight, which is a medical insourcing company which provides experienced specialists and surgical teams to DHBs. Gary is in charge of managing the relationship between Secure and DHBs, tailoring it to each organisation's needs. Finally, at the end, we have John Tamahiri, a former politician serving as a minister in Helen Clark's Labour government. More recently has been back in the political news for his campaign to become Auckland's mayor. John is well known for his advocacy for the rights of urban Māori, which has often put him at odds with iwi leadership. He has served on numerous boards in the health community sectors, including Māori TV, Wairau Primary Health Organisation and the Independent Māori Statutory Board. Sorry for that mouthful. John, if I start with you, you did an opinion piece for the New Zealand Herald earlier in this year when you said the healthcare system is fit for the museum, not the hospital, and that too much of the power rests with family doctors. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, I didn't mean anything disrespectful to Look, I think a lot of things that we have in this country and around the world are wired to last century and the one before. And we've just got to understand that there are, as a consequence, when you've got a failing status quo, which is what I'll put it, you've got to actually change. You've actually got to move for change. And so I used GPs as an example where I consider that there was a chokehold in primary health care because we want greater devolution of service brackets to a whole range of other related trades, for the want of a better way to put it. That is from scripting over the counter at pharmacies all the way to experienced practice nurses stepping up to the mark. They triage as it is right now. They should be honoured and respected for doing a lot of the heavy lifting in primary health. The idea that a pharmacist that is very well trained can only use a certain percentage of that training across the counter is just unfair in a modern society, particularly when everybody now agrees that you don't have to spend 7 years at med school to be an outstanding provider of services in the primary health space, let alone elsewhere. And that's also in mental health services. It goes across the whole line. So you don't have to spend all that time to be a psychiatrist. there's a lot of opportunities to devolve and to munner up a whole range of trades that, rightly so, can make a major contribution, but at the end of the day, everything goes to a choke point where a certain guild will have a greater say. That's yes to the year in terms of that. The final thing I'll put to you is that we're sort of dealing with the weeds there. Our biggest problem in this country and elsewhere is that we're in a bit of a headlock because of the fiscal settings, the economic settings embedded in the late 80s and then re-embedded in the early 90s. And so, unless we have a grown-up conversation about how we change those settings, how things then devolve into a whole range of sectors, health included, becomes important. Because if you don't do that, what we do in this country is we invest in the on cycle of the economy, and then we don't invest in the off cycle. Now, the result is you get major problems at counties, Manukau, for example, Gregor, where it's not the DHB's fault or the board's fault. It is an issue about a consensus of a funding model where you have to start to fund when the economy is in the down cycle as much as it is in the up cycle, so you get continuity of pipeline and infrastructure. I'm just using that as one example of why that orthodoxy just has to change and shift.
Sure. Anyone from the panel, perhaps Ian, how do your members feel about a more devolved healthcare system?
It depends what it is, I suppose, and it depends on whether it just makes good. I think there are housekeeping principles that come into place. Does it make good sense? I think that certainly within our DHB system there is a lot of scope for devolvement down. We certainly advocate what we call distributed clinical leadership, but I think that concept can go beyond clinical, in which, as part of their job, part of the workforce, many parts of the workforce are responsible and have the authority and the capacity in terms of numbers to take greater control over how things are done. Things have to be coordinated because it's an integrated system, but nevertheless I think that you can actually make a much better use of the workforce, including medical, than being made in our public hospitals and our wider DHBs than is being made at the moment. There's a lot of innovation that happens at the moment that should never be underestimated, but there's also a lot of potential where that could go much further, including into systems improvement, not just clinical service delivery improvement.
Sure. Gary, can you just give us a second on what it is that your company does? I mean, it seems to be a sort of a quick cure for waiting lists, is that right?
I don't know about a quick cure. I don't know if there is a quick cure for any waiting list, but at the moment, we know the DHBs, you've got your backlogs, which are considerable. Of course, different DHBs it's variable, and different departments it's even more variable. But where they do exist, you have options available to you. The DHBs have these options available to them, and simply they can outsource to private or wherever, and that can be costly. They can lose control of their own patients via IDF to their other DHBs, which is an inconvenience as much to the patients as it is to the hospitals. Or indeed, they can ask their own staff to come in at weekends. They pay them time and a half at the Mecca rates, so on. Or they just come to us. And what we've been doing is, for the last nearly 3 years now, as you're saying to the DHBs, look, you've got these theatres and clinics which are pretty much empty at the weekend, but they've already been funded for the year. Put them to use. So what we do is we contract with the DHBs to say, look, if we take 500 of your backlog of whatever the speciality is, and get rid of those for your weekends, how does that look to you? How does that feel for your team? And it's a weight off their mind. And for that matter, the patients themselves, quite often they can't afford the time or the money to come in during the week, so benefits everyone.
Sure. But is your business model really a symptom of problems in the healthcare system?
We wouldn't be here if there wasn't a problem. And look, my Kiwi elocution lessons haven't paid off yet, so
It's coming.
It's coming, thank you. The NHS, for example, it's been going on in the UK now for some 13 years, this model. We just happen to be the first ones to have picked it up and realised that it's needed here too. Simple as that.
Sure. I'm sure you will have all seen the report. I've lost the note in front of me. The report of the Interim Health and Disability System Review that Heather Simpson chaired recently. It came up with a very broad theme, no specific recommendations. Perhaps anyone, but for a start, Gregor. I mean, what do you think did we learn much from the report?
Well, thanks, Hamish. The report, I think, is very good. It's 312 pages long. It's quite a read, but there's a very good summary in the front. What the report said is that New Zealand does have a very good health system, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. We are fortunate. There are many countries that don't have the kind of health system that we've got. The report, for me, is very much a summation of what works well and also what doesn't work well in the New Zealand health system. I think it's been very well done. What it doesn't do is give us any recommendations. There's a hint in the front end that these are some areas where they want to make recommendations, and those are in key areas of addressing inequalities in health, particularly for Maori, Pacific and low socioeconomic persons. There's some system stuff around the way DHBs are organised. There's some stuff about leadership within the health sector, and that would go particularly in senior DHB leadership, I'm sure. And I know they'll be thinking about the number of DHBs, which has been a subject of a lot of discussion around the place. So a very good report. It's informative about where we are, but it doesn't give any light as to where we're going forwards.
Dr. Wilson, you've read the report? Would you agree with Gregor's take?
I do agree with Gregor's take. It's he's given a fairly good summary of the report. I think I'd also say that I'm a little disappointed that there isn't a stronger mention about patient safety and quality elements in the system. But I do think that, and they say quite up front in the report, that this report might be a disappointment to people, that they're trying to just describe the system as they see it, and that we wait now with bated breath for their final report in March. They have, of course, a whole list of questions, 30-something questions, I think, that they are asking people to respond to with their ideas. And so there is an opportunity for everyone to do that. And the review team is still going out and meeting with people, so there's still a lot of time to have input and for them to formulate exactly what direction they're going to recommend to government.
Sure. One of the not the recommendations, but the theme that they said they picked up was concern about the inequality of outcomes and how widespread it is. How widespread is it?
Well, I think it's very widespread. I think one of the very serious concerns about the health system that we have is the very poor outcome for Māori. And given that we have a treaty, we all need to take that very seriously. So Māori, in every kind of parameter that you look at, have twice worse, worse outcomes by twice that compared with other New Zealanders. There are multiple kind of reasons for that, and those that are much more expert than this and I will talk about the effects of colonisation over the years. Of course, there's a lot of other elements like poverty as well. But there are issues at every part of our health system, in the sense that Māori don't access services. Services aren't suited to their cultural needs. There's no partnership often with Māori about the kind of services that would suit them best. And then when they do get in the system, often they're not treated in the same way. We know that they don't get the same degree of medications for certain conditions at the same rate that the rest of us will, and thus it leads to poor outcomes. And we know that mortality is 9 or 10 years sooner than non-Māori. So it's a sad story for Aotearoa New Zealand. It's a sad story.
One at a time, anyone, what can we do to improve this? this inequity in delivery of health in New Zealand.
I'll give you an example, actually, Hamish. Recently I did a review for government, the Independent Assurance Review of the National Bowel Screening Program, and we found that Maori had poorer outcomes. But it's very interesting, actually, the incidence of bowel cancer in Maori men is lower than non-Maori. It is actually less frequent, but because they don't get to access services in good time, their outcomes are worse. We can do something about it. We can make a difference. And what is needed is that the services become more accessible for Maori in a way that is acceptable for Maori. One of the things we found is that many Maori do not want to do the bowel screening test, because they would then have to put the sample in the mail, and that I can very much understand a cultural feeling that was actually quite inappropriate. We need to find different ways of doing things so that people will access the screening test, be detected earlier in a way that's culturally acceptable for Maori. So that's one example of how we can do things differently.
Sure.
Yeah, look, I think we might have to stop talking about them as them Maori, right? They're fellow New Zealanders with the same primal human drivers and desires and rights that every other Kiwi has in the country. One of the problems I've got is, and I'll give you this example, and I won't mention the DHB, but it's got over 33% of the population within the DHB area is Māori, and so you'd know that it's lakes. So the point is that so the point is you're sitting there, right, and the reason why we're all in the room is because of the incidence of the significant presentation of Māori with presenting with major issues around cardiovascular, cancers, strokes. And it's a pricing issue that we're talking about. How can we stop this group of people coming into our wards and into tertiary space, chewing up so much significant time? So it's not as if they were there because they're talking about Māoris, right? So when you go back into their primary healthcare history, you identify across the whole of the lakes that Māori in these GP clinics get less access to bloods and tests than non-Māori in the same clinic. They get less referrals to specialist care. That's not because they don't want specialist care or that they don't want screens. It's because that they're not given them. Now, when you're looking at a population spread of that quantum, you then start to have to ask questions about why is it that non-Māori get a better service out of those GP clinics in that district. I'm only using one. I could use the Tairāwhiti and I could use the Taitokerau as well. Strong provincial rural areas, but it's the same old. And so when you ask the question, well, why is this? Why is it that somebody that's not Māori gets a perceived better deal? It's not perceived, it's real. Because you get people turning up there in final stages cancer, so on and so forth. They're a big drag, but it's not about the drag. It's about whether they got a fair shot at primary health care. And so clearly, that is across the board. That report is a bit of a whitewash with respect, because what it does is it just tells you what the status quo is. And what we've got to do is understand that brown men's difficulties cannot be fixed with white men's tools anymore. And so unless we get brought into the co-design, co-production, co-rollout, unless there's a power sharing to be had, rather than us just being treated as cattle in terms of a volume of people to be herded into a certain category and so on and so forth, we're not going to crack this one at all. And of course there's issues of socioeconomic status, and of course there's issues of a cultural nature, but by and large most Māori don't have the apprehension that a lot of the born-again Horis coming out of the universities will tell you they have. So they are like most other Kiwis, and they just want a fair shot, okay, in that socioeconomic class. But they shouldn't be having a clearly and significantly worse deal than someone in the same socioeconomic class who happens to be a non-Māori.
Sure. Anyone else? How do we, Sarah, do you have a view on how we might improve?
Yes, I guess that's something we've done a bit of research, and obviously focusing on the medicines aspect, and we did some research with the University of Auckland a few years ago and found there was huge inequities of access around funded medicines for Māori and also other groups, refugees, people living in rural areas. So we've started quite a significant piece of work actually looking at how we can help overcome some of those barriers. Now, that's not something Pharmac's going to be able to solve on its own. It means working with the wider health sector and engaging with the community, because again, we can't be telling people what to do. But there's all sorts of barriers around access to funded medicines, and it's not necessarily the high cost expensive medicines. It's heart failure, it's treatment of heart failure, it's diabetes. There are very effective treatments there, and yet we see huge disparities between outcomes between Māori and non-Māori, as John was saying. So we really want to explore that further and look at what we can do, but engaging with the community, I think that's really important, rather than us just deciding what to do and imposing a solution.
Sure.
Sorry, excuse me. It's either a frog or a hobbit in my throat. I guess what's also important, though, is the workforce itself, and I think it's just worth emphasising or reminding that medical schools have actually, despite the images of being highly traditional and white and status quo, etc., certainly Otago and I think now Auckland now have the proportion of Māori medical students is the same as the proportion of Māori in society as a whole. Now that's quite a strong foundation for the future, and that will feed through. It will take time, but it's also, although it's never a barometer, it's good to know that the new chair of the Medical Council is Māori himself, and from the Ranginui Walker family, so the DNA is pretty good. But certainly there are signs of a lot of that coming through. I think there's the greater consciousness now, although these things are always work in progress, of the Medical Council and various professional associations on cultural competency. There was a time when these weren't talked about, or rather, when they were kind of just raise eyebrows. But now it's taken much more seriously, as long as you treat that as a journey rather than a destination that's been reached.
Sure. Gary, you've been taking copious notes. Are you?
No, it's just my own.
That's fine. I wonder if there's differences in views. Obviously, people expect technology, some people expect technology to revolutionise healthcare. Ian, do you?
Well, technology is obviously critical, but the two big drivers, I think, in fact, of change in the system are a combination of workforce and technology, preferably wrapped around a workplace culture of engagement. Mm-hmm. A cloak, I suppose. But you've got to be careful because we, particularly for not so much under the current regime in the Ministry of Health, but prior to that, there was a strong emphasis on technology was the driver of everything, and it got really out of kilter. In fact, technology is an enabler. We did a long time ago. There was the shift towards day surgery. Day surgery, and that was essentially, a lot of that was to do with moving away from, just for the record, I'm not a doctor, so I'd never be a patient, but from the steel of a scalpel to lasers. Now that was still required, but by being less invasive, people could have a lot of operations and be discharged on the same day safely. More effectively. Now that was obviously, technology was there, but the workforce was there, it needed to happen. So as long as people don't get too wonky over technology being a magic bullet, there are no magic bullets in health. Magic bullets, people that describe magic bullets are generally talking bullshit in the health context. Might have been a magic bullet with Kennedy, but that's as far as it goes.
I see with the technology that there's something that came up on stuff this morning about somewhere in the world, how there's been some revolutionary jump in DNA editing, which is great. Technology is great. But what about, and I'm not going to pretend to answer this. This is just a question out there. What about the other side of it, where the New Zealand public themselves now, because of the technology, can go onto the internet and attempt to self-diagnose? There's something wrong with them. They self-diagnose and go, "That's what's wrong with me. I must go." Isn't that, it's a double-edged sword? You know, the technology for the benefit of the DHBs and the doctors, and it's fantastic. On the other side, the GP must be absolutely inundated with people going, "I've got that and I've got one of those." I know because I've just looked at it, I've just Googled it.
That's what a GP does.
Well, thank you, John. I love John. He's very controversial. It's wonderful.
You're a former GP.
I was indeed a professor of general practice by all means, but it's great. I'm lovely hearing this debate. What I think is interesting in technology is to think about where we've come from. And, you know, when I trained, we did a gallbladder operation, and someone would be in hospital for 7 days afterwards, and they'd have a long cut. Nowadays, virtually all of them are done with laparoscopic surgery. Now that's a real advance, because people go home the next day and they feel better, and recovery doesn't take 6 weeks, and other laparoscopic surgery. So the use of technology has advanced healthcare and makes a big difference. When I trained again, if we had somebody with a potential brain tumour, you had to go through a whole lot of very complex and actually unpleasant investigations. Nowadays, wheel it in, get an MRI, CT, and you've got lots of information exactly where the tumour is, its size, its impact on structures, and you've got that within 2 hours. I mean, that's technological advances. And my question might be, Hamish, what are we going to see next? Right? We know that we're going to see more and personalised healthcare with the analysis of the genomes. We're going to have medicines that actually will work for this person but may not work for this one, but we'll know why. So we haven't seen what's coming yet, but if you look backwards, you can see we've come a long way forwards, and I think that's terrific.
Sure.
So technology matters.
Sure, absolutely. But if we just go back to Gary's point, is there a risk that we must create more inequity because some people have got access to so much information and can, as well as hearing about what they might have, also getting their DNA information, and by having the wherewithal to use the health system, they get even better treatment than the people who still are not getting decent care?
I think it's a good argument, but it's flawed because actually all of these things are available in the public hospital system. So there's no reason why people shouldn't get into it. But as John rightly pointed out, we've got to make sure that people are getting the access to the care that they need.
Sarah, how do you Pharmac has a million things that it could fund in a limited pool, and it's both medicines and medical devices. How do you assess the new thing and decide whether, and make a call about something that looks exciting and has a lot of publicity compared to the thing that's done the job for a long time?
Yep. Well, I guess the key thing for us is we'll come back to the evidence. So the way our process works is that we'll get an application in from a supplier or a clinician or a patient group. The first thing for us is really to get that expert clinical advice. We have a wide network of clinicians who work on our committees, and that really helps us sort of judge where this new therapy would sit in the wider health sector. What are the options there? How does it compare to what's currently available? We'll then do an economic analysis because obviously a lot of these new technologies that are coming through are incredibly expensive. I mean, as Gregor said, they are already coming through medicines designed for specific mutations. We're already starting to see those. So there's often expensive testing that goes with the new medicine as well. So that has to be factored into our analysis as well. And then basically we have to look at all the things that are waiting to be funded and work out, well, actually what's going to deliver the best health outcomes for the population. And that's the dilemma we have, weighing that up on a sort of daily basis based on how much funding we've got available to fund the next best product that comes through.
Do you ever feel like perhaps because these things that have worked, that there's sometimes a bit of an institutional bias for what has worked as opposed to what might come along?
Well, I think it's always going to come back to the evidence. I mean, not only do we look at the evidence locally, but obviously we looked at overseas. So often, these products, by the time they get to New Zealand, may well have been used in other countries overseas. So that gives us a good idea about where their place is in treatment, what are the risks, benefits, and how can we take that forward. So there's always the new exciting stuff that comes through, but there's also other medicines that come through that perhaps don't get the attention that actually can offer really good health outcomes. So we have to make sure that we're looking at everything in a fair and even way.
Sure. I'm sure Pharmac's model is something that most people in New Zealand have an opinion. Dr. Wilson, I mean, do you think they have the getting the balance right and how they assess medicines and so on?
Yeah, I've always been a strong supporter of Pharmac, actually, from way back. I think we're very lucky in New Zealand to have an agency like Pharmac that is, I think has a very rigorous both advisory approach and economic approach to look at what is best for our country and what is affordable as well. So, you do have to think about the affordability issue in New Zealand. So, yes, I support what Sarah has been saying. Yeah.
Can I? Well, I support that, but can I just add to it that it also needs to be seen in context. Pharmac is not operating in a level playing field. It is operating in an international market. And to put it bluntly, it's dealing with the forces of evil, if I could describe the large pharmaceutical companies in that not light-hearted way. So you need a whole sector as a whole approach to it, particularly in a small country. You need a degree of cohesiveness. You have to be evidence-based. You will be confronted with fairly sophisticated spin, and I know you experienced that yourself, Gregor, in your time with Pharmac. And some of it does capture the hearts at times of people, hearts and minds of people who are desperate and who are in need of treatment. So, I think there's always some from time to time you can say, well, maybe Pharmac should have done that a bit differently. But the model and the overall approach, I think, has been sound and robust in a very uneven, vicious at times, evil bastards, if I could say, environment. So I think those institutions, even when we might argue around the margins, we should support to the hilt.
Do you have some frustrations you'd like to share?
I think Pharmac's an amazing organisation. I think they've had some very difficult challenges figuring out which drugs to fund. I'm pleased that they have experts, specialists who work in each area, in haematology, respiratory medicine, cardiovascular medicine. These experts are poring over the evidence that comes from overseas, and I'm talking about clinical trials and research, and they're making recommendations to the board along with management who are doing the health economic work and saying, well, this drug will give a 1% increase in outcomes and it's going to cost that. If we had that money available, could we make a big difference somewhere else? How can we win for the New Zealand public? I'm thrilled to bits, by the way, with the government's investment in the Cancer Control Agency, and that Pharmac have got 60 million, I think, over 2 years. 2 years. Yeah. So new investment in cancer drugs. These are important things, and I think they should be congratulated for achieving that.
If perhaps Sarah can't talk about it, but perhaps others can. If we're talking about the future of healthcare, we've already seen a number of examples where even politicians have almost announced that certain drugs will be funded. Do you see that as something that's likely to increase in the future? I suspect that's something of a loaded question. And what do you do about it?
It will increase. The reason why it will increase is because you're starting to get a far more literate society in terms of what their loved ones are suffering from and what might be available in the market. Then what they do is they ginger group it up, So we've got a major change possibly in cancer care, solely because a 38-year-old white farmer from Southland ran the flag up. It was a 38-year-old Māori off a labour site suffering from asbestosis. It wouldn't have been the same thing. I want to say that because that's exactly what it took, a white guy from the Southland to raise the flag, to get some action and with some immediacy in time from the time that he was diagnosed to the time he regretfully passed away. And this is what we're up against So I'm just trying to use these examples to show that when Māori have difficulties with the power players that make all the distribution, that a lot of people get funded off our failure rather than fix it. And so what we've got to do is acknowledge the role of Farmac, and we do. You've also got to then you've got to watch whether you're funding emotion and noise as opposed to logic and the like, because we all love those that we're sticking up for. There's no doubt about that, and it's not a misleading love; it's a deeply driven love. And so you know we've got a family now in terms of breast cancers and the like, trying to force Farmac into a certain treatment and purchasing program. I'm resistant to that motion, but it's pretty tough to look at someone that loves their loved ones and say this mob here is clearly denying them access to something that we can't afford. Very easy argument to make, very difficult to defend.
Sure. Anyway, I mean, how do we protect Farmac's independence?
Well, I think one thing we don't do is allow trade agreements, for example, or possible future trade agreements, to encroach upon the functioning of Farmac. I think that had the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, as it was previously known, when the US was party of it, gone ahead in its form at that time, Farmac wouldn't have been negotiating with one hand behind its back. It would be negotiating with two hands by its back, and the pharmaceutical companies interfering and getting extra insights into its internal decision-making processes and getting a real commercial edge. So I think that's certainly where we should not go. And if we do get to go into further trade agreements that get into this area, then there need to be firm boundaries.
Yes, in every one of those trade agreements there's an exclusion clause, and it's the treaty clause. It's never been used, never been applied, because white folk in this country see it as advancing one person's interests. It doesn't. It actually is a clause that provides significant leverage from First Nations people all around the world. It's never been applied here because the people that don't want to apply it have never seen it for that. They've seen it really as more of a native thing as opposed to an all of New Zealand treaty issue. And the day that you can make an exception to the rule in those trading agreements by using that exception is the day that you start to break the rule. So I think you should think about that.
I want to talk about the workforce that we have in New Zealand and whether it's suitable, because one of the things that came up in the I'll call it the Heather Simpson report was that we have to really get used to the idea that in the future having a disability will be the norm rather than the exception. Do we have the workforce that will cope with the challenges that we know are coming?
No. Simple as that. No.
What do we do about it?
Well, look, let's have a problem. Can I use just one example of the problem? We destroyed our human capability in the 90s when we had this massive transition from institutions, and with some good reasons as to why that occurred. I'm just talking mental health. And so if we could use that as a proxy just for this discussion. What happened is that we destroyed huge human capacity and created a vacuum. With the incidence and the increase, something happened in New Zealand's water supply because Farmac started funding antidepressants going through the roof over the 2000s. And Kiwis sort of were getting dosed up on all sorts of things. So when you start to look at that, just that algorithm and antidepressants and the increase of it, you know that there are major issues. What we've never come to terms with, what are the drivers of those issues? So we've used pharmaceuticals, like in my mum's time it was the Valium Valley. Anyway, these wonderful tea parties. But so the thing is, what we've got to understand is that this is a happening thing. If we could just use that as an example of how we cut costs, and that causes huge knock-on expenses to uplift our ability into the future. So with this new mental health funding dollars, you start to see, don't you, the devolution into two different types of workers, and psychology. There's now an arts degree in psychology gets you through the gate. I don't know how that all works in terms of the hierarchy of mental health care, but I do think we've got people on the panel here who are very expert in this area, and they might care to make a contribution using that as a proxy, because it's across the whole of the health sector, actually.
So I was, for my sins, formerly Deputy Chair of Health Workforce New Zealand. Now I need to explain their budget's 180 million, and it's for postgraduate education for nurses, doctors, physios, OTs, audiologists, and in fact 27 health professionals. So it has to cover all of that. I don't think the issue is about that. I think the issue is that we simply don't have enough nurses. Let me give you an example. The last report at the Capital Coast District Health Board I see indicated a shortage of 144 FTEs of nurses. That's significant. That means we're not training enough nurses. We know from what we see in the newspapers that we're not training enough midwives, and I'm actually delighted that the government has seen fit to invest in mental health, to come to your point, John. And I think that's great. And they talk of 1,600 health coaches. Now, that's good. And my question, I think even John would agree, where they're going to come from. Now, a health coach has got to be somebody, according to the funded plan, who has vocational registration in something, because it has to fit under the Health Practitioners Competency Assurance Act. And that means it's got to be nurse, can be doctors, but it won't be. It'll be nurses, physios, OTs and the like, who have had additional training to deliver mental health services that'll be available for short consultations in primary care, and it doesn't have to be in general practice, it can be anywhere. In fact, there's one in the student health service at the university. So yes, we have shortages, we need to address them, and because of the time taken to train people, we've got to actually invest early and make sure that we can deliver the right kind of people.
My friend here, who I've just met, said that the answer was no, and it's as simple as that. I have a different view. The answer is yes, but it's not as simple as that. Part of it is that I think there are capacity issues, and Gregor's just talked about that. From the standpoint of specialists in our public hospitals, the surveys that we're doing of clinical leaders in the various departments, we're looking at shortages of around about 24% at the moment. Now, and yet when we look at the official vacancy rate, it's about a third to a half of that being advertised. So there's a huge gap there, and we've got an overstretched workforce. So capacity has to be addressed. But the other thing is that the workforce is adaptive. Role of doctors changes over time. The role of nursing changes over time. We don't need necessarily, I'm not critical of the mental health report and the issue that's just been raised, but as a generalisation, a lot of it can be done not by inventing new roles, but allowing and encouraging existing roles to adapt, to expand their scope. I don't know whether there was ever a time that the medical profession controlled the thermometer or not, but if it did, it's never sought to reclaim it. Unless Gregor can recall something to the contrary. So I think that there's a lot of adaptation potentially there. The exigency, as much as anything else, of professionalism drives a lot of adaptation to do things better in a different way. Just got to provide the climate for it and the numbers for it.
Sure.
And the culture.
Well, I'd actually add that there are shifts in the way care is being delivered. For example, gastroscopies and other instrumentation, colonoscopies and the like, are actually now able to be delivered by suitably trained nurses. And what's wrong with that? And similarly, other services are being delivered by other parts of the workforce in a way that opens up the opportunities. And historically that's been the case, that as the workforce becomes skilled, it can move to other parts of the workforce and people can upskill, use their vocational registration and deliver services in a broader way. So I think Ian's point about allowing the workforce to diversify is actually on the case.
Correct. I mean, we at Secure do the same thing with, for example, Avastin injections. Historically, it'd be consultants only that administered these. It's not the case at all. The nurses are more than capable, and we've got teams that go out across the DHBs and put through these Avastin injections every weekend. It's a lot cheaper for everyone.
Dr. Wilson, you.
Yeah, well, there is, of course, a total untapped workforce in patients or consumers or people with lived experience themselves, and indeed carers. And if we pick up the mental health example, there are a lot of what we call peer support workers who have a formal training now, but are often then on a pathway to other professional groupings if they want to, do nursing or occupational therapy or whatever. And we could do a lot more of that, not just in mental health, but in care of the older people and other kind of service disability support services, and also family. Carers themselves are coming in to be formal support workers in many of these, mental health, older people services and so on. And it's totally untapped. And, we haven't talked a lot about the kind of consumer voice or the people with lived experience and the partnerships that need to kind of occur to get the right kind of services that suit them. And I think John mentioned the word co-design, and co-design for Māori, absolutely, but co-design right across the board between providers and the people that they're servicing. Yeah.
You often hear debated whether we need the number of DHBs that we have, and whether that is part of the problem. Is it actually part of the problem, or if we were to reduce the number of DHBs to whatever number, would we be making more of a sacrifice than we're gaining in having one fewer chief executive and one fewer finance director?
Look, there's always an argument on an economic level about scales of economy. Right, yep. Always is. We've tried a number of iterations of that in this country and ended up quite poorly. I was still a believer in scalability, and also in terms of the way in which New Zealand's geopolitical face is changing quite dramatically and relevant to where populations are. Talking about Auckland, Northland, and ultimately, I don't know if anyone's here from Hamilton, but basically that'll be South Auckland in 10 years' time. And if we put the Blues and the Chiefs together, we might be able to win a game. But if we could put that to one.
Not while the Blues are there.
If we could sort that out, you have an understanding. Then as infrastructure starts to tie up Northport, Tauranga to the Hamilton across, you then have communities of significant interest starting to bear in, and also that's where our population growth is going to be in significance. So we really have to start to come together, as opposed to having a number of 20 warlords running different games all around the country. Then the amount of money that's been spent and wasted on IT alone is a disgraceful comment on probity issues up and down health. It's a fact. And so if we start to acknowledge where we've gone wrong, we might be able to start to have a look at, what was the causation of that, and how might we reconfigure? And so a lot of what we've got is out of that noise again, and that emotion again, where I'm not blaming Annette King for a thing, but we've got to get scales going. I thought in the 90s, where the regional health authorities were going on funded provider splits, was very a good and clever thing to do. Ultimately, that got broken up in the 90s, late 90s.
Sure.
That's my take.
Anyone else hack back the number of DHBs to a dozen?
Yes, I've been fairly public in saying that I think we probably do have too many DHBs. 20 is quite a lot. If you look at other international health systems and you go to Wales, they've got a similar population to New Zealand. They have 7 health boards, and they haven't felt any desire or need to increase it. So I think economies can be achieved as a result of scale, and I personally think we've just got too many DHBs. I think there's costs sitting in there in terms of management, IT, as we've heard, financial systems, reporting systems, and too much management. So I think there are some economies of scale to be achieved. Where the report of the review will go is a moot point. and I certainly acknowledge that on the other side of the scale, when you disrupt a system and change the number of DHBs, for example, that takes 2 years to recover from. We've seen that when we went from the Health Funding Authority over to the DHB system, and we saw it before then. So we do have to be careful. We need to do things thoughtfully. We need to make sure we understand why we're doing things. But I think ultimately there probably needs to be a change in the number.
Sorry.
There are a couple of things though as well, and that is warlords is one thing. One of the DHB chief executives said to me, 20 sovereign states, and that's because of the legislation. Yes. So that they're all allowed to, to be sovereign, apart from government expectations that are a little bit, but their accountabilities to their community largely. So you have to deal with that issue so that there is more of a national consistent legislation, so that they are, required by law to 12 or 20 to actually work in a different way. The second issue is that having community participation or involvement, whether it's through the voting system, which isn't all that great, or whatever it is quite important. I think DHBs or whatever do need to engage with their community, understand the health needs of the community, listen and talk to the people, and engage in a co-design kind of way. And how do you kind of get that element in a nationally consistent approach? And of course, the third issue, which you talked about for RHAs, well, how do you get people to network, particularly around, cancer networks, trauma network, there's an intensive care network, there are, neurological services. So how do you get, where do you get the services that can get the highest quality for people who need them? So, specialists need to be, and Ian probably knows more about this than I do, but specialists need to do so many things, see so many people, or do so many operations in order to stay competent. And so you can't, for some rare disorders, or even for trauma, that needs to be focused in a special trauma team in a trauma centre. That's just one example. So how do you get that working where people don't want to, I had a colleague once who said, we can't do neurosurgery on the kitchen table. And it was almost like people wanted to do neurosurgery in their patch. And you have to have a conversation with the community about sometimes you have to move in order to have the best care.
So if you've got, I guess, obviously I'm the relative newcomer here, but you've got 20 DHBs and not all 20 of the 20 DHBs can cater for everything. So I tend, for what it's worth, I tend to agree that probably having fewer DHBs makes sense, but then the patients, you need some kind of support structure to get the patients to these DHBs where the specialities will lie, surely. No.
And that happens now already if you were to just look at Starsha. So just as one example. So there's ways around that.
I agree.
It's like Te Puia Hospital. Te Puia Hospital is deeply embedded in the minds, hearts and souls of all Ngāti Pro people, because their grandparents, great-grandparents were birthed there, so on and so. But it's an outlier sitting there, and there's this romantic desire to hold on to Te Puia Hospital, right in the middle of nowhere. I don't mean that disrespectfully to the cousin over here, but I'm just trying to say, there's different ways of now delivering healthcare, and in the old days we all had our own hospital, but it was an overstated comment about what it really was. Pyro had its hospital, Teams has the hospital. It's just we've all had to change.
I have a different view to some of those being expressed, and that is that I think it becomes a distraction. And I think structural change does not drive of itself substantive process, etc. change. It should be the other way around. Now, I also am very conscious of how the Otago and Southland boards were merged into Southern. And if ever there was an example of how not to do a merger, that was it. It was top-down, clinical advice was ignored, It was as if geography never existed in the mindsets of driving at a huge geographic expanse. The idea is it would cut management costs, it increased it. It would reduce debt, it increased it in both DHBs. In fact, took one of the smaller one into debt and compounded the debt of the existing one. Everything that could be done, stuffed up, happened. So you've got to be careful. And so what is the problem you're trying to solve? If you're, say, talking about, let's say, over the hill Wairarapa, into maybe it should merge in with the Hutt Valley or Wellington or Capital and Coast or both. The real issue is not that, but what are the services that should be provided in the Wairarapa? And that's the first thing. Because if you're going to provide a public hospital with more or less the services currently provided, a lot of orthopaedics, general surgery, O&G, some paediatrics, etc., if you're going to still be mental health, still be doing that, the only way to make savings is actually to cut a lot of that out. That's where the savings are, by cutting services. I think we would still struggle with IT, and I get I was once told by someone that the three things that specialists really were fearful of: competition, exams, and car parking. You add IT to that list. It's really frustrating. For the life of me, I cannot understand, whether it's 20 or 10 DHBs, why we cannot have a national electronic patient system. We've made some advances in some areas there regionally, but we should have been there years ago. And that wouldn't have mattered. It's not the number of DHBs is the problem. So I think first of all, we've got to focus on what are the services that we should be providing in smaller communities and bigger communities, middle-sized communities, and then look at the structure that you wrap around it. But if you go straight to structure, you'll miss the boat completely. You'll distract the discussion from the more meaningful issues. You will miss the addressing the drivers of change and the drivers of innovation. And you basically cock it up.
It's back to the point of sovereign states. I wonder, from Gary and perhaps of Sarah, if she'll be prepared to, what do you experience between DHBs? Are they consistent in how they operate and
No. Certainly, I guess we're in a slightly unusual position that we're a national agency managing budget on behalf of DHB. So we have this continued tension with trying to get agreement from DHBs. You talk about the electronic patient record, you still would have to go through 20 boards to get them all to agree, and that's the problem, that even though there is an element of, well, it doesn't really matter, but it sort of does, because all the processes are multiplied over and over again. So from our point of view, I guess we're quite lucky that we've got a mandate to actually fund things. We don't have to get approval or permission, but we obviously have to work very closely with the DHBs, and when it comes to implementation, everybody wants to do everything a bit differently, and I think that's probably multiplied up right across the board. I guess the other point I'd sort of make, just listening to the conversation, there is a bit of a tendency when we talk about DHBs to think about hospitals, and I think that's also part of the worry with this discussion as well, is that there is that focus that DHBs equals hospitals, and it's actually really important that primary care is part of this conversation as well. And the danger is, I think, that they get a bit left out, and we end up, we've got fragmented services in primary care, but that has to be a really important part of this discussion as well. And I think it will be with the health and disability system review, but the focus on DHBs tends to be on hospitals rather than the whole system.
Sure. Gary, you work with some DHBs, but not all of them.
So at the moment, I've been working with 11, and some DHBs I've seen faster glacial movement, but again, I'm the newcomer here, and what has astounded me so far is, we're all working for the health of the public, New Zealand public, and the level of competition between the DHBs is astonishing. It astonishes me. I've not become desensitised to it yet, I guess, but I hear a lot of stories, I don't have the answers, of course, but I was actually quite shocked. We're talking about DHBs that are actually very, very close to each other. Is there a, brotherhood of arms? No.
Right.
Not what I sense.
Yeah, look, for my sins at this moment, I manage the whānau order contract across the whole of the North Island, right? And you've got to deal with 15 DHBs because we've got our preeminent provider groups embedded in high deprivation status communities. Having to troll through all this, there's 15 different conversations
20.
And you've got 15 different CFOs. You've got 15 different native managers of health. Not one of them has a financial delegation because no one trusts the natives near the till. So you've got to go through all that. This is you've got to be a bit flippant about this because the power disparity in terms of devolution, or at least giving mana to some of your Māori staff, is another issue. So it's just a nightmare to try and work this. So what we've had to do is evolve our own systemic. That's whānau tahi, right? So we bought global the connected care system. We also brought Simple Health because you can only grow by way of acquisitions in New Zealand. It's too slow organically. And so we're now the biggest, second biggest provider of social service programs in this country, just signing up a deal with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the States. We get more acknowledgement offshore for bringing differences in changes and measurable changes than we do onshore here. And that's because you've got all these 15 different warlords, all the chairpersons, CEOs, they've all got their own games. And so it doesn't matter. Where I disagree with you is it's about the execution of the change where we've got it wrong rather than whether the probity of the change is right. There's two separate conversations. We can all understand what went wrong. It's a matter of understanding the great intent as to why you should have some mergers.
And my point, though, John, is that before you go down a structural change, you've got to have a clear understanding of what you want to do, how you want to do it, and what are the services we should be providing in this particular locality and different ones in another locality.
Yeah, and what happened down south there is just reprehensible. But that's a study in what not to do across the whole line.
We haven't seen many studies on what to do. Or how best to do it, I should say. You might draw up a list for us.
I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I do want to say that in our experience over the last 8 years, where we've been running national quality improvement programs, we have managed to get clinicians at that level to work collaboratively together in a national program and work with consumers or service users together. And so it can be done. People do get to work as a network, start to agree the right thing to do to improve a particular focused area, so like infections of, a surgical site infection or a central line infection, etc. It's that focused. You can get agreement and you can get energy and drive and get a really good national collaboration where there is no competition, except about who has the best outcomes, of course, so that they're all quite interested in why has one DHB got better outcomes in this than others, and what are they doing that we're not. So you can kind of drive that kind of benchmarking. So it is possible at that level to get people to work in this small country of ours in a better way. Yeah.
I'm just going to go for one more theme, and then if anyone's got questions, prepare for them now. Come back in a minute. We're in a situation where the combined deficit of the DHBs, I understand, is $1 billion. Is that just the fact that the health system is not being funded enough, or is that a different structural problem, or both?
Okay, so the deficit at the 30th of June 2019 was 532 million, and then you add on the 600 odd million that is due in wages, so that's how you reach your billion. That's a pretty substantial sum. If you look at what happened under the previous governments, the increments each year for the DHBs did not match what is called medical inflation. Didn't even match actually CPI. And the consequence of that is that the DHBs have been chronically underfunded. And I understand why you might do that. You might do that because you wanted to create efficiencies, put in pressure drivers that actually put pressure on the DHBs to be more efficient in the way they do things. I'm not actually convinced that 20 DHBs have got it wrong. Actually, if I saw one or two as an outlier and you put a bit of pressure on them, you could understand making a difference. But actually 20 DHBs all got it wrong. I don't think that's true. So I think what's happened is we haven't funded health in the way that we should have. Understand various reasons for that, but actually I think we're going to have to invest in health if we want to continue to have the kind of health system that we want.
Do we have any questions?
Great, I've got to go to the green parrot now.
You touched on voting really briefly, and local body election voting is like really dire, but I feel like DHBs are on like a level of their own. Lots of, like my peers are like, I don't know anything about the DHB, I don't know anything about these candidates. How do you turn that around and get, everyday people actually interested and invested in who these people are on the boards?
Well, I've just failed, and can I tell you that?
You should have the answer.
When you open the envelope, right, it's just this cacophony of names that come out of here. If you've got a European name in the top 10 of A, B, C, D down, you stand a 70% greater chance of being elected. Yeah. No, it's as simple as that. As simple as it's this is just a metric fact. So I tried to change my name to Aardvark, but the point is that that's as crazy as the system is. And then, depending on where you live, you've got to pick not just the mayor. Then you've got your local boards, community boards. If you've got trusts, DHBs, so you've got all this. You got the lot. To suggest that the people that are being elected are being elected on merit and because they're well known in their communities, etc., is not true. If we had sophisticated exit polling, it would just be not true. This is a lottery, right? So it's desperately broken. So we need to have a think about a number of things. One of them is, of course, the Aussies have compulsory elections, right? Rather voting. I think the greatest civic duty anyone can have to protect our democracy is to vote, right? The fact that they don't, just drives me crazy. So the leafy suburbs voted me out. Not that I was in. So if you know what I'm trying to say, 1/3 of our society in all local body elections determines the rule in local government. 1/3. Whereas it's about 72% depending on the split in national. How the hell do you get people more invested in that? A lot of them are just putting one foot in front of the other. So what we've got is an extraordinarily complex systemic upon which to make a democratic call. And I don't have the answers to that apart from getting people to stump up compulsorily. And once they do, they might have to think about it before they tick the first top 10 on the alphabet.
Actually, it's quite interesting. It's a great question. I was once faced with a situation as to how we were going to randomise the list, because you can do that. So we got the local policeman in, and we had a drawing in front of all the board, and we kept on pulling them out. And the guy whose name started with V landed up being pulled last, poor man. So randomisation didn't help him. Having said that, I think there's another issue actually, which is around the balance of skills on boards. So what happens is you land up with 7 elected, and that's all out there now. We know who's there. And then the minister is charged with appointing the chair and the deputy chair and 2 others. And often, because of underrepresentation, the minister needs to make appointments to bring balance, and it's often around, dare I say, Maori and Pacific people, to bring those good people onto the board so that at least they've got a say at the board table. I think there may be other ways of getting representation of community view democracy, if you like, into decision making, and Janice, I think, referred to that very ably. Maybe there are other ways, and to ensure that we do hear the community voice, the democratic voice, and the way that we provide health services. And I think we need to have another think about the mix on boards so that we get the mix right.
I'm not even sure that board should be. I'll just be controversial here. Should have anyone elected, because they're big businesses. They're huge businesses, most of them, and they're very difficult to run.
I mean, just to put that in perspective, we're talking about $1.5 billion. Now, there's not that many businesses on the stock exchange that are that size. So you have, people who get elected, very well-meaning, and many of them great people, but that's a big responsibility.
It's more than 1.5 billion. It's more than 1.5 billion.
Per board.
Per DHB,
Per board,
Yeah.
But you do need community engagement, and we have to think about how to do that creatively and in a better way.
And do you have an idea of
No,
how you might? I mean, I just back to John. I mean, compulsory voting. I mean, wouldn't that make it worse when you'll have, you know, if you think that at least perhaps most of the people who are voting in local elections, not obviously they didn't know what to do in Auckland, but the people who are voting in
No, they failed.
that they might be the ones that are engaged. If you force everyone to vote, it'll be presumably even more of a lottery.
Well, it's possible, but in the Australian experience, very few ballots are spoiled. That's point one. And point two is that they do preferentials. So they're obliged then to take a greater responsibility in terms of rating preferentiality. And that also allows a whole range of other things to go on in the campaigns. So that actually, the argument there is that it supposedly heightens participation in the democratic process, which is what we're all trying to do. Okay, and you don't get young people out, right? 15% of people under 30 vote. Okay, so it's not going to be a huge. The people that make all decisions in DHB country are predominantly 50, 55, European and up. Just the way it is.
Yeah, look, it's a slightly different view. I think that in terms of elected, I'm talking about DHB specifically, elected members, first of all on the competence side, I've seen as much incompetence from appointed board members as I have from elected. I don't believe there's a difference.
Not too big.
He's fine. But I'm thinking that, for example, a couple of examples, many years ago, a very dicey IT system was introduced from El Paso, of all places, into Capital and Coast, called Shared Medical Systems. That decision was made by an appointed board chair. The appointment of, I don't want to go too far because of litigation, but the expenses controversy at Waikato DHB with the chief executive, that decision was driven by an appointed board chair. Psychologist to boot. What does that tell you? So there have been plenty of very foolish decisions made, including in the IT area, by appointed people. So I don't think it's a competency issue. I think there is a problem with elected members believing that they're actually going to have a degree of influence. And some of the people I've spoken to have been elected members and decided not to stand again felt really disenfranchised once they were on. There were too many constraints, and it's partly the unresolved tension we have in New Zealand about to what extent is it a series of local health systems and to what extent it is a national system. Now, all countries have that tension, and we manage it better than most, but nevertheless there's a tension. Not necessarily a bad one, but I think there's a bit in the national level that's actually missing a bit, where there's not a sufficient sense of cohesion in some respects. But I think where elected members are on, and they find that in many areas they're marginalised in what they can say. Now, some ignore all of that and say what they think anyway, but a lot of people do feel muzzled, and so maybe it's also the expectations of what elected members have in a system that hasn't quite worked out to what extent it should be devolved and to what extent it should be, and that, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Sure. Do we have any other questions?
Two, actually.
Sure.
First one, more of an observation. I come from a place where voting is compulsory. It doesn't work. Really.
Yeah, that's one pay the state.
And what happens is that we actually put into the hands of only a few people too much authority and actually too much power. So it concerns me that if we have less DHBs, and you're talking about 1.5 billion, it's already too hard to be managed in the hands of lots of people. So how do you feel about actually having less people to control all of that? And isn't that harder, and actually doesn't it open spaces for, I don't know, corruption, errors, or management, misplaces, things like that?
It does, and well, let's go back to first principles. The way in which we run our market in New Zealand is a bit of a facade and a sham, right? Because we believe that it's hugely competitive, but actually it's just a bunch of cartels, duopolies and monopolies. So that's everything from electricity to the banks to the two construction importers and the like. Everything's fixed. So when you put a tender in around New Zealand for anything, it's you get told where the upper and the lower margins are, right? And so even the tender system in New Zealand is a rort. So I don't know, what country did you come from?
Brazil.
Brazil. Oh, well, good. Well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. I went to the Olympics there. Anyway, it's another story. So just to follow, if you follow through what I'm saying, which is where I started my conversation, which was the present orthodoxy is just wrong. I think we mine the best out of it. We need to start to change. So you have to start to change your competition law. You've got to start to change by putting in an internal affairs department that has no skin in the game, that is not connected anywhere near, because the scalability of our businesses is growing quite significantly. If you just look at Auckland City, it's a $60 billion balance sheet. It's the biggest balance. You put the 19 top stocks together, and that's the balance sheet that's been managed up there by a lot of folk who, with respect, have probably outrun their ability to manage that scale. When that happens, you get incompetence, and when that happens, you get corruption. So you need a lot of. We need to grow up as a country and start to implement a lot more what I'd call a separate. People say, "Oh no, our audit and risk committee will look after that," and the auditors will nonsense. So my big thing is that no, let's start to have the implementation of an internal affairs department, no skin in the game, not connected to anybody in the game, but with an ability to look through the back of your IT system going forward, look at different things just in terms of your own quality control and quality assurance, and that would be very helpful as to where we are as New Zealand society, because today we see it as a smart business deal as opposed to that was a grafted deal created by crooks. Thank you. Anyway, look, the Green Parrot's calling. So I've got a meeting.
All right, we are just about out of time. Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming along, and thank you very much to all of our panel for being here.
You've been listening to Chalk Talks, thanks to Secure and NZME.